Ever since I was a child, the wilderness was my second home. I was the kind of girl who found peace among towering trees and starry skies, who loved the smell of pine and the crunch of boots on gravel. But no matter how breathtaking the view, one thing always pulled me back to reality: dead batteries. Flashlights, GPS devices, emergency radios, everything needed power. And solar panels? They were bulky, inefficient, and nearly useless if the weather wasn't perfect. I wasn't just going to accept that. I had a background in materials science and an insatiable curiosity. I became obsessed with solving the problem. I wanted to create a new kind of solar technology, something flexible, powerful, and revolutionary. So I did what any determined dreamer would. I turned my garage into a lab.by day. I worked a 9-to-5 job. By night, I soldered circuits on my kitchen table, ran experiments, and burned through notebooks filled with calculations and designs. I had no funding, no corporate backing, just grit, sleepless nights, and a fire in my chest. It took 2 years of failures, fires, and fried prototypes, but I did it. I created a paper-thin photovoltaic film that was not only incredibly efficient but worked indoors and in low-light conditions. You could wrap it around a backpack, line a jacket, apply it to glass. It was the future. I called it the Helios film, and I wasn't going to let it sit in a drawer. I invested every cent I had, about $30,000, into creating a fully functional prototype. It was fragile, beautiful, and powerful. I held it in my hands and knew this wasn't just a gadget. It was the foundation of a company. I named that company Helios, after the Greek god of the sun. But even gods need help. That's when I brought in 2 people I trusted: David Chen, a quiet genius of an engineer who could build anything from scratch, and Sarah Jenkins, a marketing wizard with a magnetic personality and connections that could open doors. The 3 of us were unstoppable. We weren't co-workers, we were a family. We worked in my garage, shared takeout dinners, and built something extraordinary together. We created our first product, a featherlight power bank powered entirely by the Helios film. It wasn't just a hit, it was a sensation. Tech blogs called it the death of the low battery warning. But with success came pressure. We needed capital to scale. That meant entering the lion's den of Silicon Valley. That's where we met Gavin Croft, a name whispered within venture capital circles. Gavin was the archetype of a top-tier investor, charming, razor-sharp, dressed like a GQ cover model, and known for turning tiny startups into billion-dollar empires. When we pitched Helios to him, he didn't just listen, he understood. He didn't see a product. He saw a platform. He painted a vision of Helios technology in smart homes, cars, airplanes. He leaned in during our final meeting and said, "Jessica, you haven't built a product. You've built a revolution. We want to be in the Jessica Miller business." I was speechless. Gavin Croft wanted to invest in us. He offered $10 million in Series A funding, an unimaginable amount. It was validation, credibility, and rocket fuel for our dreams. But there was a catch. He wanted 2 board seats. He also insisted we bring in a seasoned executive team, a COO and a CFO from his own network. People with experience, he said. People who could scale a company to greatness. It felt like giving up control. But David and Sarah were ecstatic. They begged me to say yes. "It's just business, Jess," Sarah said. "You'll still be CEO. This just gives us the structure we need to grow." Gavin smiled and reassured me. "You're the soul of Helios, Jessica. No one's taking that from you." I believed them. I signed the deal, and in doing so, I unknowingly signed away the keys to my kingdom. The next 6 months were a blur of explosive growth. With Gavin's money and his executive team in place, Helios moved out of my garage and into a sleek, glass-walled office in Palo Alto. From the outside, we were a startup on fire. The media loved us. Venture blogs sang our praises. Helios was the next big thing, and Jessica Miller, was heralded as the woman leading the solar revolution. But behind closed doors, the story was different. The new executives, Mark, our COO, and Carter, the CFO, brought with them a new culture. Gone were the scrappy team huddles and late-night brainstorms. Now everything was driven by metrics, KPIs, and endless Excel sheets. The soul of the company, the passion, the vision, was being replaced by cold, calculated efficiency, and I could feel myself slowly being cut out. It started with the meetings. Gavin and Mark began holding pre-board discussions without me. They framed them as just prep, but that's where the real decisions were being made. By the time the actual board meeting rolled around, everything had already been decided. Then came the budget controls. Suddenly, I needed approval for every hire, every vendor contract, every product decision. Mark would smile and say it was just tightening up operations, but it was clear I was being sidelined. Sarah, who used to be my closest ally, drifted further into Gavin's orbit. She loved the glamorous new world, the corporate cards, the power lunches, the glitzy tech conferences. And David, my brilliant, loyal engineer, he just kept his head down, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what we'd built. He didn't speak up. He didn't push back. He just disappeared into the background. I was still the CEO, but only on paper. Then came the final blow. Gavin introduced a motion at a board meeting to sell the exclusive licensing rights of the Helios film to a massive electronics conglomerate. A short-term windfall worth hundreds of millions. To them, it was a slam dunk. To me, it was a betrayal of everything we stood for. The deal would get our mission. Helios would no longer build products. That changed lives. We'd become just another tech supplier, another faceless cog in a giant corporate machine. I stood my ground. I argued passionately. I showed projections, brand strategies, long-term value. But the board ignored me. Gavin, Mark, and Carter voted yes. Sarah abstained. David sat silent. I had lost control of my own dream. The next day, I was removed. Gavin called an emergency board meeting, one I wasn't even invited to. My assistant, who still had some loyalty left, called me in tears. Jessica, they just voted you out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just froze. An hour later, a lawyer from a firm I didn't recognize called to inform me that I'd been terminated as CEO of Helios, effective immediately. He said it with the tone of someone reading off a parking ticket. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. You are not permitted to contact any current employees. When I arrived, my keycard was already deactivated. The security guard who had once called me boss now wouldn't meet my eyes. My office had been packed up. My personal items were in a cardboard box. Mark was waiting, expressionless. The board feels this is in the best interest of the company, he said, as if I was a vendor being offboarded. I saw Sarah and David across the open floor. They didn't say a word. They just looked away. That walk out of Helios past the desks I bought, the people I hired, the dream I built was the longest of my life. My hands trembled around that cardboard box. My heart was a stone. They hadn't just fired me. They had erased me. But what they didn't realize was that I had written the rules of the game, and they had just triggered checkmate. When I got home that night, I didn't collapse into tears. I didn't scream or throw things. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I once soldered the first Helios prototype, and opened a drawer. Inside was a single document, the original founder's agreement, not the version Gavin's legal team drafted when the Series A closed. The original, the one I had created with my lawyer long before anyone even knew Helios existed. I flipped to Section 7B. Subsection 4, the clause Gavin and his entire high-priced legal team had overlooked. My lawyer had once called it paranoid genius, a backup clause, a relic of my trust issues. At the time, Sarah and David had signed it without a second glance, and now it was the blade I would use to gut them. It was called the Founder's Reversion Clause. A clause so buried in legal nuance that only a forensic audit could uncover it. And it said, in precise, binding language, in the event that the founding CEO and the inventor of the core Helios film technology is removed from their position, without due cause defined as criminal activity or gross negligence, all rights to the core intellectual property, including but not limited to patents, prototypes, designs, and exclusive licensing authority, shall revert to a previously established holding company solely owned by said founding CEO. That holding company? A dormant LLC I had set up 5 years ago, named fittingly Garage Innovations LLC. They hadn't fired a CEO. They had triggered a full legal reversion of the IP they thought they owned. I called my original lawyer, the only person I truly trusted, and we met the next morning. He flipped through the agreement with a growing smile. They didn't read this, he muttered, astonished. No, I said. They saw me as a dreamer, a scientist. They never looked for the strategist. We filed the reversion papers immediately. Within 48 hours, the Helios film patents were no longer owned by Helios Inc. They were legally and irrevocably the property of Garage Innovations LLC. Helios Inc. was now a company with no intellectual property, no rights to manufacture or license. The Helios film, no legal basis to sell the product Gavin had promised, but I wasn't ready to strike yet. Not yet. I needed them to walk themselves to the edge. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched the company from a distance as Gavin doubled down. News leaked about a pending 9-figure licensing deal with a multinational electronics conglomerate. Helios was going to sell exclusive rights to the Helios film for hundreds of millions. They were positioning it as the company's defining deal, a crowning achievement. Gavin was basking in the spotlight. Sarah and David followed in his shadow, pretending not to see the house of cards beneath their feet, and I let them. I wanted them to climb higher. So the fall would be spectacular. When the date of the deal signing was announced, a massive press conference at a luxury hotel in San Francisco, I made my move. I didn't show up at the press event. I went straight to the top. That morning, my lawyer and I walked into the hotel's penthouse suite where Mr. Thompson, the CEO of the electronics giant, was staying with his legal team. We sat across from 4 of the most powerful lawyers in the country. They looked at me like I was a footnote, until we slid the folder across the table. Inside, a copy of the original founder's agreement, evidence of my termination, legal filings showing that the IP now belonged to Garage Innovations. Look, there was silence, then a rustle of paper, then disbelief. Wait, are you saying this company doesn't own the Helios film? I'm not saying it, my lawyer replied. The contract is. Helios Inc. owns nothing. They are attempting to sell you a license they no longer possess. If you sign this deal, you are buying air. The lawyers went pale. One of them muttered, "Get Gavin Croft on the phone." I didn't have to be in the ballroom to imagine what happened next. Gavin would have been strutting, preening for the cameras when his phone rang. That call destroyed him. The press conference was abruptly canceled. Scheduling conflicts, the PR team claimed, but everyone in the industry knew something had gone horribly wrong. Helios Inc.'s game-changing deal had just evaporated, and I was just getting started. The next morning, Helios Inc. was a battlefield. The headlines hit the tech news cycle like a meteor. 3 million Helios deal falls apart, IP ownership in question, anonymous source. Helios doesn't own their own tech, Patriot Ventures star investment implodes overnight inside the company. Panic set in. Investors flooded Gavin's inbox with furious emails. Employees were terrified. Engineers didn't know if the product they were building was even legal to manufacture. The once slick boardroom was now in crisis mode, and I watched from my modest apartment, sipping coffee, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Then I struck. My lawyer delivered a formal letter to the board of Helios. Inc.it was short. It was brutal. It was non-negotiable. Garage Innovations LLC, sole and rightful owner of the Helios film technology, is willing to grant a temporary, non-exclusive license back to Helios Inc. under one condition: the immediate resignation of the entire current board of directors. This includes Mr. Gavin Croft, Mr. Mark the COO, and all appointed executives. A new board shall be constituted, with Jessica Miller named as chairwoman. If they refused, the company would be forced to liquidate. Their investors would lose everything. The licensing deal would be permanently dead. The brand would be worthless. Checkmate. They folded in less than 24 hours. Gavin Croft resigned in disgrace. Mark, the COO, was escorted out of the office. Ironically, the same way I had been weeks before. Helios Inc. was mine again. But I wasn't done. I called a board meeting. The only attendees, Sarah and David, they looked hollow, ashamed, older somehow. The fire that once lit our early days in my garage had been replaced by the dull flicker of regret. They tried to apologize, rambling hollow words about pressure, manipulation, not knowing how to stop it. I held up a hand. "I'm not here for apologies," I said, my voice sharp and unshaken. "I'm here for accountability." I slid 2 envelopes across the table. Inside are your new contracts. If you choose to stay. They opened them. Their roles had been demoted. Sarah was now senior marketing coordinator. David was senior engineer, reporting to a new director of engineering. Their board seats were non-voting for the next 2 years. Their salaries were reduced. Their titles stripped. Sarah's hands trembled. David looked like he might cry. "You can choose to leave," I said evenly, "or you can earn your way back, just like I had to. The choice is yours." They both signed in silence, because they knew they had helped burn down our dream. And now, if they wanted to rebuild it, they would do so under my terms. I stood alone in the office that night. The glass walls of our Palo Alto headquarters glowed with the setting sun. Everything was quiet. This space had once been taken from me, but now it was mine again. Not just the company, not just the patents, not just the title, my soul, my vision, my power. And I didn't reclaim it with rage or sabotage. I reclaimed it by planning, waiting, watching, letting them build their empire of arrogance just so I could tear it down with the same hands that built it. They thought they'd erased me. They thought I'd be forgotten. But now, the world knows who really created Helios. Not because I screamed, not because I fought dirty, but because I wrote the rules of the game and they forgot I was the one holding the original playbook. And that was their fatal mistake.